The most powerful weapon in America right now may not be money, votes, or even the presidency itself. It may be the ability to convince millions of people that judges cannot be trusted anymore. Because once that idea settles into the bloodstream of a country, once enough citizens begin seeing courtrooms as political theaters instead of legal institutions, the entire architecture of constitutional democracy starts wobbling like a skyscraper with cracks running through its foundation. And that is why what happened inside a Manhattan courtroom involving Donald Trump, Judge Arthur Engoron, and New York Attorney General Letitia James matters far beyond one civil fraud ruling or one billionaire defendant staring down a judge across a wooden bench. For a few brief minutes, cameras were allowed inside that courtroom. America saw Donald Trump sitting silently at the defense table, glaring directly at Judge Engoron, the same judge who had already ruled that Trump fraudulently inflated the value of his assets to secure favorable loans and insurance deals. 4 rows behind Trump sat Letitia James, watching him with the kind of expression that did not look political anymore. It looked personal, historical, like 2 people standing inside a collision that had been building for years. Then suddenly the cameras were thrown out, the doors closed. The official proceedings continued. But outside that courtroom, something much bigger than a fraud trial exploded into motion. Because this was never going to stay about accounting spreadsheets and real estate valuations. The second Judge Engoron imposed penalties exceeding $350 million and barred Donald Trump from running companies in New York for 3 years. The legal battle mutated into something else entirely. Within hours, allies of the former president flooded television, podcasts, social media, and press conferences with the same message. The judge was corrupt, the system was rigged, the courts were being weaponized against a political opponent. Listen carefully to the language because the wording matters. They were not merely arguing that the ruling was incorrect. They were attacking the legitimacy of the people delivering the ruling itself. And that distinction changes everything. In America, losing a court case is supposed to trigger appeals, counter-arguments, legal briefs, motions, evidence. That is how the system survives disagreement. But what happens when legal defeat becomes the trigger for a public intimidation campaign aimed directly at judges? What happens when a billionaire with one of the largest political megaphones on earth labels a sitting judge evil before millions of followers already primed for outrage? The answer is not theoretical anymore. Federal judges now require increased security. Threats spike after high-profile rulings. Families of judges are being forced into conversations no family inside a functioning constitutional democracy should ever have to hold. Do we need protection? Should we worry about our address becoming public? What happens if someone shows up at the house? That is the part nobody in the official press conferences wants to linger on too long. Because once you strip away the partisan screaming, the hashtags, the fundraising emails, and the television spin, the core question becomes terrifyingly simple. If Americans stop believing judges are independent, then what exactly remains standing between raw political power and everyone else? And here is where the story becomes far darker than most headlines are willing to admit. Because the pressure campaign surrounding Donald Trump's New York fraud case did not emerge organically like some spontaneous burst of public frustration. It moved with the precision of a preloaded response system. The ruling landed, and almost immediately the machinery activated. Television surrogates repeated identical phrases. Social media influencers pushed the same narrative. Political allies framed Judge Arthur Engoron not as a jurist interpreting evidence, but as an enemy actor participating in a coordinated attack against Donald Trump. The speed alone should make people uncomfortable. Real public reactions are messy. They contradict themselves. They evolve. Coordinated narratives arrive polished, synchronized, emotionally loaded, and ready for broadcast before most Americans have even read a single page of the ruling itself. And the ruling mattered because the evidence stack was enormous. Judge Engoron did not wake up one morning and randomly decide to fine Donald Trump hundreds of millions of dollars. The court reviewed years of financial statements, asset valuations, insurance representations, and loan documents. Prosecutors argued that Trump's organization systematically inflated property values to obtain favorable financial treatment. We are talking about square footage discrepancies, exaggerated valuations of penthouses, inflated property assessments, and statements of financial condition that allegedly transformed ordinary assets into fantasy world numbers. This was not framed in court as a clerical typo or a paperwork misunderstanding. The state argued it was a pattern, a business model, a deliberate inflation machine operating across years of transactions. Now watch what happens rhetorically after that finding. Trump's allies do not spend most of their energy disputing every individual valuation line by line for the public. They jump straight to attacking motive, corruption, political persecution, weaponization. Why? Because arguing spreadsheets on television loses emotional momentum fast, but turning a judge into a villain transforms legal accountability into political warfare. It changes the emotional center of gravity. Suddenly, the focus is no longer, did fraud occur? The focus becomes, can you trust the people accusing him? That pivot is not accidental, it is strategic, and it is devastatingly effective in a media environment addicted to outrage instead of evidence. Then came another extraordinary twist. Trump's legal team filed a motion seeking Judge Engoron's recusal, citing reports connected to outside communications involving attorney Adam Bailey. Again, notice the broader pattern. The courtroom itself becomes secondary. The surrounding ecosystem becomes the battlefield. Every side issue, every media report, every procedural dispute becomes ammunition in a larger campaign to delegitimize the process before the final legal dust even settles. And when enough Americans start believing every unfavorable ruling is automatically corrupt, the justice system begins losing the one thing it cannot function without: public confidence. That is why this situation extends far beyond Donald Trump himself. A regular American accountant falsifying financial statements could face ruin. A small business owner inflating values to secure loans could lose everything. Ordinary people do not have millions of followers ready to declare the judge evil within minutes of a ruling. They do not have political networks framing accountability as tyranny. That moral contrast sits at the center of this entire crisis, like a live electrical wire, one system for ordinary citizens. Another battlefield entirely when power, celebrity, money, and political tribalism enter the equation, and Americans can feel that imbalance instinctively even before they fully understand the legal details. And the intimidation dimension becomes impossible to ignore once you zoom out and examine the full sequence instead of isolated headlines. Because this pattern did not begin and end with one courtroom in Manhattan. Every time a judge rules against Donald Trump or one of his political allies, the same escalation cycle appears almost mechanically. First comes the ruling, then comes the outrage blast across social media, then the judge's motives are questioned, then the legitimacy of the court itself comes under attack. After that, threats emerge, security concerns rise, and suddenly a constitutional institution begins operating under pressure conditions that look less like stable democracy and more like a country testing how much intimidation its judiciary can absorb before something cracks. And here is the prosecutorial question nobody can comfortably answer. If this is not meant to pressure judges, then what exactly is the intended outcome? Because words have consequences, especially when they come from figures with enormous political influence. Donald Trump calling legal cases weaponization is not just rhetorical venting anymore. His allies amplifying corrupt judge narratives is not ordinary criticism anymore. When millions of supporters are emotionally activated around the belief that judges are enemies rather than arbiters, the psychological environment surrounding every future ruling changes. Judges know it, lawyers know it, federal marshals know it, even the public knows it at some instinctive level. The robe still exists, the courtroom still exists. But the invisible pressure surrounding those institutions becomes heavier every single time this cycle repeats. Then the White House briefing room poured gasoline onto an already raging fire. Because instead of strongly defending judicial independence as a constitutional principle, the messaging shifted toward framing judges themselves as contributors to a constitutional crisis. Think about how extraordinary that is for a second. America's system was specifically designed around separation of powers. The executive branch is supposed to coexist with judicial review, not politically condition the public to distrust it whenever rulings become inconvenient. The founders anticipated disagreement between branches. They did not anticipate a digital age ecosystem where attacks on judges could be amplified globally within minutes by political networks operating like synchronized media strike teams. And technology changed the scale of the threat completely. In the past, a politician angry at a judge could hold a press conference or issue a statement that would fade by the next news cycle. Today, a single post reaches tens of millions instantly. Algorithms reward anger because outrage keeps people scrolling longer. The platforms do not care whether constitutional legitimacy is being damaged. They care about engagement metrics. So when a powerful figure labels a judge evil, the system amplifies it automatically because fury is profitable. That creates one of the most dangerous feedback loops in modern democracy. Emotional outrage generating clicks, clicks generating reach, reach generating pressure, pressure generating fear. And the human cost behind that machinery is real. Somewhere in America tonight, federal judges are discussing security procedures with their spouses because they ruled on politically explosive cases. Court staff are dealing with threats that would have sounded unimaginable a decade ago. Families connected to the judiciary are being dragged into online hate storms simply because someone applied statutory law against a powerful political figure. That is not normal democratic disagreement. That is institutional corrosion happening in public view. And the truly chilling part is how quickly Americans are becoming desensitized to it, almost like the country is slowly adjusting to a level of hostility that once would have triggered national alarm. And maybe that is the most dangerous development of all. Not the shouting, not the press conferences, not even the billions of dollars, the lawsuits, or the endless political warfare surrounding Donald Trump. The real danger is normalization, because democracies rarely collapse in one dramatic explosion. They erode through repetition, through fatigue, through citizens gradually accepting behavior that once would have shocked the country into collective disbelief. The first time a judge requires serious protection after a political ruling, people panic. The fifth time, people scroll past it between sports highlights and celebrity gossip. That psychological adaptation is where institutional decay quietly wins. The founders understood that the judiciary would always be the most fragile branch of government. Congress controls money, the presidency controls enforcement power. Judges possess neither. Their authority survives entirely on public belief that court rulings still matter even when they anger powerful people. Strip away that belief, and the entire structure becomes decorative. A courtroom turns into a stage set. A judicial opinion becomes just another partisan document competing for attention inside a social media battlefield flooded with propaganda, outrage, and algorithmically amplified rage. That is why the stakes here are much larger than Donald Trump's fraud case in New York. Because this confrontation is forcing America into a brutally uncomfortable question: does the rule of law still apply equally when political power reaches a certain scale? A warehouse worker accused of falsifying financial documents does not get to call the judge corrupt before millions of followers. A waitress struggling through an IRS audit does not have a media apparatus capable of reframing accountability as persecution. Ordinary Americans experience the legal system as something immovable, cold, and immediate. Mispayments, break regulations, falsify records, and consequences arrive fast. But when elite power enters the frame, suddenly every investigation becomes political, every ruling becomes rigged, and every institution enforcing accountability becomes the alleged villain. And that inversion has consequences far beyond one presidency. Because once enough Americans are conditioned to believe courts only matter when their side wins, constitutional order starts dissolving into tribal loyalty. At that point, judges are no longer viewed as interpreters of law. They become treated like rival politicians wearing robes. Every ruling triggers emotional warfare instead of legal analysis. Every indictment becomes proof of conspiracy. Every unfavorable decision becomes evidence that the system itself is illegitimate. That is not healthy skepticism. Democracies need skepticism. This is something different. This is systematic erosion of institutional trust under the pressure of coordinated outrage campaigns, powered by politics, media ecosystems, billionaire influence, and technological amplification operating all at once. And history offers an ugly warning about where that road can lead. Countries do not wake up one morning and announce that judicial independence has died. Instead, the courts slowly become intimidated, exhausted, delegitimized, and politically isolated until eventually their rulings still exist on paper but no longer command genuine respect. The law technically survives. The culture protecting the law does not. That is the cliff edge America keeps inching toward every time a judge becomes a public enemy because they issued an inconvenient ruling against someone powerful. So, when you look back at that silent stare-down between Donald Trump and Judge Arthur Engoron inside that Manhattan courtroom, understand what you were really watching. Not just a billionaire defendant angry at a legal defeat. Not just a prosecutor pursuing a historic case. You were watching a stress test for the American constitutional system itself, a test of whether institutions can still withstand organized pressure campaigns fueled by political fury and digital outrage. And the question hanging over all of it is brutally simple. If judges become afraid to rule against power, then who exactly is left to enforce the law against power at all? If you found this breakdown valuable, make sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Because the deeper this crisis becomes, the more important it is that people keep paying attention before the damage becomes irreversible.